Welcome to my messy studio, everyone. My name is Mark, and I'm an artist and an art professor. And in this video, we're going to discuss a principle of color which will help you make your drawings and paintings feel more unified. The principle of color echo. This principle, more of a trick really, was something heavily used by the post-impressionists, but was also used by the old masters. As always, I'm going to show you some paintings which illustrate this principle, and then show you how it works in practice by doing a short demo. Let's get started. The color echo principle is very simple. It states that if you use a color in one part of your work, you should also use some version of it in other parts. In other words, colors should not be used in isolation. Often this principle is applied to color accents, touches of bright color that stand out against the overall color scheme in a piece. Here is a painting by Matisse. Notice how he takes the vermilion red color of the goldfish and uses it in a number of other places. For example, in the darker, more muted shades on the table at the bottom, at the base of the balcony window, and on the edges of what looks to be a pillow. That color also makes a subtle appearance in the background, peeking through the purplish gray building. This is what I mean by color echo. The color isn't used at the same strength and could be lighter, darker, more muted, or even a slightly different hue. It's not the same color, just like an echo is not the same as the original sound. Distributing the color throughout a picture brings everything in the composition together, making the image feel more unified, and through that unification, stronger. By the way, you can have more than one color echo in a work of art. Note that the bright green at the bottom is also echoed by the green color of the street, and that the blue of the sky is echoed by the blue in the fishbowl. Here is another very famous example by Van Gogh. Again, color echoes are often used when dealing with strong color accents. The turquoise green at the top of the painting echoes in many ways throughout, most directly in some of the wine bottles, but also in a much lighter form on the tabletops, and surprisingly, the hair of the man in the white suit standing next to the pool table. But there are also more subtle, non-accent colors being echoed. The raw sienna surrounding the lamps has echoes in the chair in the foreground and in the wood grain of the floorboards. The interplay of color in this painting is quite complex, and the more you stare at it, the more echoes you can identify. But the unity created by the echo is felt immediately. Many things have to work well in order for a composition to succeed, and I've covered the principles of composition in detail on my channel, including in my previous video where I discussed the role of overlapping shapes and diagonals in creating unity and movement. But of all the organizing principles which pull a composition together, this is one of the most powerful, and happens to be one of the easiest to pull off. And lest you think that color echo was only used by the post-impressionists, here is an example from the Baroque period, Las Meninas by Velázquez. Notice how he sprinkles little vermilion red accents throughout the painting, in the cross of St. James on his vest and his palette, in the mirror reflecting the royal couple, in the bodice brooch and cuffs in the dress of the Infanta, and in the pantaloons of the court dwarf. Such distribution of bright accents not only serves to enliven the painting, which would otherwise feel almost monochromatic, but the saturated reds also carry the eye through the painting like beacons in a dark sea. Now, obviously, when working for imagination or with an expressionistic color scheme where color accuracy is not the objective, creating color echoes is simply a matter of being aware of the principle and using it. It's when you're working from observation that things get tricky. Sometimes color echoes are given to you by the subject matter, they're just there to be recorded, but often they're not, and you have to find sneaky, underhanded, and nefarious ways of introducing them. That's what we're going to deal with now. We're going to add color to this sketch, which I've already inked, and see if we can implement the principle of color echo without being entirely unfaithful to the original colors we're seeing in the reference. Now, normally, this is where I would tell you that this part of the tutorial is reserved for channel members, and that if you're not one, you're out of luck. I'm not going to do that now because I'd like to offer you a small sample of what you're missing out as an enticement. For the price of a ridiculously overpriced coffee, channel members get access to an extensive library of tutorials and 2 new classes on a variety of art making subjects every single month. So please enjoy this free sample of my long-form instruction and consider joining up. Okay, now let's talk about how you use the principle of color echo in actual practice. When you're dealing with a palette that is post-impressionist or expressionist, where you're using colors that are not observational, where they're more psychological, then the principle of color echo is really up to you. You can set it up however you want. However, when you're working from a reference, from observation, it really depends. Sometimes the reference gives color echoes to you. So you're going to look at the reference and see that, a color in the background is similar to a color somewhere in the foreground, and the colors are kind of evenly distributed throughout the piece. However, in most cases, you're going to have to impose the principle of color echo in subtle ways into your reference. So we're going to be doing that in a bit. But our first task is to generally block in all the colors in the composition. Now, you don't always have to do that, particularly if you're working on a quick sketch and there's some time limitations. You can work on one area at a time. That's going to allow you to work faster. However, if you have the time and color is a concern, blocking in the colors first before getting specific about all the detail colors is going to help make your color selections better. Why? Because we see colors in relationship to other colors. So mixing colors in isolation, working on one spot, getting it completely rendered, is usually a recipe for getting the color wrong. Because it's only when we are able to see one color next to another color, next to another color, that we can actually triangulate whether we've mixed up our colors correctly. So the first step in watercolor is to very lightly indicate all the colors in the composition. And we're going to start thinking about the principle of color echo even at this stage. So we can really start anywhere, but let's start mixing up a few general skin tones here. I'm going to list my palette color selection in the description section along with all the other materials I'm using. So the first step is to mix up a very light wash that's going to represent the highlights of the skin tone. It's going to be very, very light. And then to make those highlights even lighter, I'm going to use a paper towel and pick out those areas where I need to see highlight. A little bit on the forehead, maybe on the inside of the eye, on the upper eyelid here. Okay, these are things that I do while the wash is still wet. Okay. Now I'm going to do the same thing for the skin tone on her hands, which, as you can see, is a little bit redder. All right, the skin tones at the extremities, at elbows, fingers, hands, tends to be a little bit warmer, a little bit more red. And then, if there are any highlights, I'm going to use my paper towel to lift them up. And then I keep moving. Right, so now I'm going to block in, let's see, I'm going to work on areas that are not wet yet. Let's see, so let's block in some of the colors in the background. Now, there are a lot of colors there. However, it's a background area. We don't want to get it too busy. So we are going to have some color variety there, definitely some color echoes, but it's a good idea to select one dominant color and wash it in so that the entire area is inflected with that color, infused with that general color. Okay, so here we're going to block in a few different colors. We've got some turquoise, which is going to play a part in our color echo later. And when you're blocking in colors, pay attention to where those colors are. Right? These colors are in the background. We don't want them too strong. We don't want them to attract attention, to pull attention away from my area of focus, which is going to be the portrait. So we're going to block them in a very simple way, and we're going to keep those colors generally muted. Okay, now we can block in the color of the shirt. Which has this lovely violet color. And I notice it's getting a little bit warmer in this hand. I'm going to try to record that information. And that's something I can do in my color blocking stage. So I'm trying to fight the tendency to put in details. I'm just trying to think about overall color movement. That is generally lighter here and darker here. That's going to set up my details later. It helps to do this blocking in stage with a larger brush, by the way. Why? It keeps you from tinkering too early. Okay, let's keep blocking in our background colors. There's a lot going on there. I don't want the complexity in the background to overwhelm my area of focus. So I'm going to make sure the colors there are A, muted, B, simpler. Right, I'm organizing shapes into larger shapes as much as possible, eliminating bundles of books, old CDs, muting the color, obviously. And trying to organize things into larger blocks of color. Okay, I'm jumping around a little bit. Let's get some of the colors blocked in here. And this is where we actually start thinking about color echoes. So now we have a number of colors down. We have a little bit of the same yellow color that we have up here, down here. I'm going to elaborate on it later, but for right now I can just block it in this way. And then this table is made of glass, so the shirt continues downward. But we start getting lots and lots of reflections, lots of color complexity here. And this is, once again, where I can start putting in color echoes. So here we have that same violet going down. But then I'm noticing that some of the reflections, not reflecting off these turquoise CDs, but the color does potentially start going turquoise here. So I'm going to take a little bit of that turquoise color in a more muted form, and I'm going to start carrying it downward, building a connection between the color here and the color down here. Okay, let's keep working on the background. So we have this bright orange color here. Even in this block-in stage, I keep the colors relatively simple, but I'm changing them. Meaning that I never put in colors flat. I'm always thinking about what the general movement of the colors are, from lighter to darker, warmer, cooler, more saturated, less saturated. So that even in this block-in stage, the colors have some movement to them. That's going to set up even more color complexity later. Never paint your colors flat, even in the block-in stage. Think about how the colors change, how they move, what's the difference between the color here and the color here, the color here, the color here. How does the color move? And how does the color help the composition? Because that's even more important. Where do you need colors to be more saturated, less saturated, warmer, cooler, softer? Okay, let's put in the general color of her hair, and notice that the hair is a little bit lighter here and a little bit darker this way. And I'm going to think about color echo. So we have this brown here. Maybe we can use a similar brown in the hair. So it's going to be lighter towards the top. And then towards the sides, it gets a little bit darker. And also changes color. So we're going to talk primarily about the principal color echo in this video. But it's impossible to talk about things in isolation. When you're mixing colors, think about what the differences are. How does the color move? How does the color change? So when mixing colors, the question should be, what is the difference? What's the difference between the color here and the color here and the color here? And then what is the difference between the color here and the color here? What is the difference? Even when working on a little sketch like this, using portable materials, think about what is the difference. Okay, let's keep moving with the color block in. So we have this. Let's block it in. It has kind of a yellowish tint to it. We don't want it to be too strong, right? We don't want strong contrast here because that's going to pull attention away from my area of focus. So I'm going to wash that in with a little bit of yellow ochre. Knock it down a little bit. And then think about if I can establish a color echo. So I already have one here, but there's also a little bit of that same color in the chair. So let's put in another color echo here. Okay. Now, the palette on this box is very small. The mixing area on this palette is very small, which can be a little bit irritating, and it requires me to clean the surface. But you notice that I'm not doing that all that often. Why? Because I'm using the colors I previously mixed to mix up the next set of colors. That also helps create color unity. So your colors don't always have to be clean. Often you're mixing up muddy colors. But by taking some of the previous mixture and mixing it into whatever you mix up next, it helps build color connection. So we're not constantly building color from scratch. Sometimes we're using previous mixtures to build the next set of mixtures. That also helps create color unity. And this is where having a small range of colors is really helpful. One of the difficulties about working with a large palette is that there's a tendency to want to mix colors in a bunch of different ways, particularly in landscape, right? Every time you encounter a new green, you use a different green mixture, using different green pigments. The difficulty is that if the greens are all very different from each other because you're using different types of green, it can potentially break up the painting, disunify, rupture the painting because you're using very different colors everywhere. By using the same mixtures but varying them, using the same green with some variation to it, it helps build color unity. So this is, in one respect, why working with a smaller palette with a limited palette, limited number of colors, sometimes gives you better results, more unified results. Okay, so now I'm just going to block in the brown of the chair. Again, this is just a block-in stage. It allows me to see the composition overall so that I can start organizing it as a whole. Again, this is a really important principle. Block in your colors so you can see the painting, the drawing, in its entirety. So what else haven't we blocked in? Okay, we haven't blocked in the colors here. Let's do that. Okay, we have a few more areas we need to block in. Let me clean up my palette a little bit. Because there's one color echo which I'm going to make fairly strong. The connection between the turquoise CDs here and here in the pen. So here, I'm going to make the color a little bit stronger, maybe even introduce some green pigment to it, because that's going to be my color accent. And we're just going to get rid of the white, because white is very distracting. It prevents me from seeing my colors accurately. Anytime you have a white area, it makes all the colors next to it feel kind of muddy, feel dark. So the quicker I lose the white, the easier time I'm going to have seeing what the colors actually need to be. Okay, so I'm going to wash over the paper a little bit. Again, I'm seeing how the color moves. So it's a little bit darker here. There's some violet in there. And as it gets lighter, it becomes a little more yellow. Okay, one more area to block in right here. And this is still a little bit wet, but I'm just going to get rid of the white here. Okay, where else? Okay, we have a little bit of skin tone to mix up. Here, we left that area white. Okay, and now all my colors are blocked in. Now I'm going to go in, really starting anywhere and getting more specific. So I'm probably going to start off with the face. That's going to be the most difficult area, and then work my way out and try to organize the composition. Okay, now that my colors are blocked in, we can start working into detail, organizing the composition in terms of value, and also possibly introducing additional color echoes. So let me clean up my palette. And at this point, I can do a lot less moving around. I can focus on one area because all the colors are blocked in, and I can see one color against another color against another color. I can start anywhere, but I'm going to start with my skin tones. So I'm going to wash over the entire skin tone with a warmer color. And then use my paper towel to regain my highlights. And while my washes are still wet, introduce a little bit of form. So these are going to be some very delicate halftones. And I could obviously do this while the washes are dry, but this helps save me time. Right. The washes are still wet, and they're moving around. I don't have to do quite as much blending. Most of the darker values have some of this violet in them. Why? Because light is bouncing off the shirt and reflecting back into the shadows here. And that's another way of really automatically building color echoes, color connections, thinking about how adjacent colors interact with each other. So if you have some kind of strong color next to another color, some of that color is going to bleed, it's going to leak into the color next to it. So now I'm going to add some subtle reds into her cheeks. These things are very soft, so I'm trying to be careful here. Otherwise, my skin tones are going to be splotchy, which I don't want. Getting skin tone really requires a separate video, and perhaps I'll do one at some point soon. But the main thing is that skin tone is not one color. So the main principle is to keep the colors moving, thinking about how the color gets warmer, cooler, redder, more yellow. Because if I mix up my skin tones all one way, it's not going to feel like skin tone. So even if you don't get it exactly right, the most important thing is color movement. Okay, so I'm going to let this dry a little bit and then come back to it and add some additional stronger shadows. In the meantime, let's work on the hand. So the color here is a little bit redder. This smaller mixing area is a little bit annoying. I have to constantly make sure that I have a clean surface to work on when I need clean colors. Right? So I mentioned that using previous mixtures to get the subsequent mixtures is a good way to go, connecting colors. But if you want your colors clean, then you have to clean your palette every time, which can get annoying. Okay, and I'm going to take this opportunity to put in some halftones. So halftones, if you're not familiar, are areas in the light that go a little bit darker. They're not quite shadow. Basically, a darker form of light. In an image like this, where there's not a lot of strong shadows, halftones are going to be very, very important. Okay, so while my skin tone's dry, let's go back to the hair. Now, in a portrait, the area of focus needs to be the face, the body, the hands, but really the face. We can create a stronger area of focus by introducing stronger details into it, but we can also think about introducing stronger contrast in areas just outside the area of focus to essentially create a frame. So in this case, we have darker hair. I'm going to make it even darker to make sure that the area of focus is stronger than anything else, which is particularly important because we have some fairly busy background details. So inside the hair, we've got some darker shadows. I might decide to go even darker there. Now, that said, one additional complication when you're working with a pen and not just watercolor alone. the pen should be the darkest value in your image. So I'm going to try, I might not succeed exactly, not to go so dark that my pen work is obscured. And since I'm using not a pure black ink, I'm using a brown ink, I'm going to restrict my very darkest values to something just a little bit lighter than my line work. Why? If I go darker, I'm going to lose my lines, and all the hard work I put in the hatching will be for nothing. The washes are going to interfere. I don't want that to happen. Okay, so the washes here are dark. They don't go quite as dark as the line work, so we can still see a little bit of line work inside even the very darkest values. Okay, and now I'm going to move down. So let's work on the shirt a little bit. I want to get the sense that light is coming from the side and that there's a little bit more shadow here. This is going to require me to clean off my palette. Trying to see if I can get a sense that light is hitting the side of her arm. And here I think the color's right. I don't think it needs to go darker. Just going to introduce some details here. Okay, and now let's work on the background areas a little bit. So here we have a fairly strong area in the reference. I'm going to soften it a little bit, and I think the first thing I'm going to do is just wash over this entire area. I don't want it quite that bright. So before we put in any details back there, I'm just going to knock it down slightly. Now I notice that it's warmer here, and then it gets filled in with slightly cooler colors. Even though that area is in the background, I still want color complexity there. Keep your colors moving absolutely everywhere. Now, one thing I try to introduce is some sense that there are some strong, clear, large shapes in the background. I'm going to see if I can maintain that sense. I don't want my background to be too busy, but I do want movement there. I do want to have a sense that there's depth, there's light, there's shadow. I want it to be subtle, though. And one thing to keep in mind is that often very strong geometric shapes have a lot of visual pull, meaning that they can distract from areas that are more complex, more organic. And their graphic, sharp nature makes them very, very strong. So the key is not to make the contrast there too great. Right? You know, normally if I was oil painting, I would go in and soften some of the edges here. I think I'm just going to limit the contrast so that the pull here doesn't go quite as strong as the pull here. Now, I'm going to have to adjust some of the details here, make them a little bit stronger. Right? Why? Because composition is a balancing act. Right? We have visual pull in certain areas, and I need to diminish some areas. In watercolor, you can make that kind of diminishing effect by softening some of the washes, lifting them up. I try not to do that. That tends to make the painting feel muddier. But if I have to, I will. Absolutely. Okay, so this area I'm going to make a little bit darker, and because it's close to the area of focus, I'm also going to saturate it a little bit. Make the color here a little bit richer. Here too. And as this color shows through the chair, I'm going to diminish the color a little bit. And here is where having previous mixtures on the palette is really helpful. Again, it helps build color connections, so I'm not mixing everything from absolute scratch. Okay, let's work our way down and build some stronger color connections here at the bottom. So I can see this color reflecting here. We can introduce some of it. And then we can also take some of the turquoise up here and carry it down. I'm not seeing this reflection. I'm putting it in anyway. Let's clean up my palette and put in some of these stronger turquoises here. First, I'm going to start off with purple. And now some of those turquoises. Back to purple again. Okay, so let's wash in some of the values of this chair. It is going pretty dark, and it's competing, particularly in the strength of the shape, with some of the darks in the hair. I'm going to try to make some of the darks in the hair go a little bit darker. And look, this might require me to go back in to my sketch with the pen, which I often do towards the end to make those kinds of adjustments. But for right now, I'm just aware that the darks here shouldn't go as dark as the hair, otherwise they're going to pull attention away from my area of focus. So let's go just a little bit darker here. I'm not going to worry too much about getting those reflections. They're just distracting. And you can see that I've actually adjusted the shape of the chair. Right? The overlap between the shoulder and the bottom of the chair here is not ideal. It's what's called a tangent. If you haven't seen my video on the basics of composition, a tangent is an awkward alignment of two objects that are at different depths. So it creates confusion as to what is in front of what. So the chair is behind her shoulder, but because the contours are aligned in the reference, it's not clear what is in front of what, which creates visual confusion. Tangents should be avoided. Right, so whenever I see a tangent in a reference, I make sure that there's a clarity of overlap. I make sure that it's super clear that the viewer can see what is in front of what, which is why I ran the chair this way. Okay, so there's our second application. Now I can start going in and putting in some detail. Okay, let's go in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, now let's go in for our third pass, where we're going to add detail and hopefully some additional colors that are going to tie things together. Let's put in a little bit of detail here. We're way at the edge of the composition, so we want to make sure to keep things here relatively soft. But that doesn't mean that we have to make things boring. So just because something's way at the edge of the composition doesn't mean there shouldn't be some kind of variety there. Things in the corners should be just kind of space filler, afterthought. So basically what I'm doing here is taking a lesson from Las Meninas, where you have lots of empty space in the background, but there's a suggestion of things happening there. Paintings, architecture, right? Some kind of movement. Even in details that are just barely rendered, there should be some kind of areas of interest. Color shifts, right? I'm trying not to repeat the pattern of books here, so books are going different directions, they're different shapes, going at different angles. Again, I want to avoid being too busy there. But my point is that nothing should be afterthought. Nothing should be space filler, even in a quick sketch like this. Which means that I'm going to add some variety of color to the books, and this is going to be an excellent opportunity to use color echoes to tie things together. So we can definitely introduce some turquoise colors. They're actually there in the reference. But we can also use some of the reds in the facial features. So for example, hopefully without making things, again, too busy, we can use some reds here. So for example, this book could have touches of red. This is going to tie this area in terms of color with some of the pinks in the hands. We can definitely have some of the turquoise color. Some of the colors could be a little bit more yellow, mimicking some of the colors here. Okay, let's work our way down. Let's put in some additional detail here. Again, usually when mixing muddy colors, I don't clean off my palette. I don't need to. And by incorporating some of the previous colors in your palette, you start to automatically, by default, creating color echoes. Okay, so let's put in some little detail here in the CDs. And maybe some of the colors here could be even stronger. Even though they're in the background, they're still relatively close to the area of focus and will help draw the eye towards the center of the composition. Here I have to be careful. Right, the detail here, if I make it too busy, it's going to start pulling attention away from my area of focus. Definitely don't want that. But again, just because something is outside the area of focus doesn't mean that you want it to be boring, uninteresting. Just get a better angle on this stroke. And we can still have some color variety there. So we can introduce, again, some reds, some turquoises. Suggest a little bit of wood grain texture here. It's way in the background. Again, I don't want it to be too busy. But a richer color here is going to help emphasize the area of focus, and I think plays really well with the violet color of the shirt. Okay, so this chair, we have to be careful. It's off to the side. Here I'm going to introduce slightly darker details. Just to give it a stronger shape. Always want to suggest some kind of three-dimensionality. And the fact that the chair is facing us is not really good. It's not good for the depth in the composition. It's not ideal. But the thing to recognize is that most often when you're working from a reference, even if you have taken a brilliant photo, there's going to be things in the image that are going to require adjustments. Even if the photo is great, right? There's a difference between a really good photo and a really good image. These two things are different. Photos are a different art form. They have different visual requirements. The way you compose in a photo is not the same way you compose in a painting. These two things are not the same. And here I'm going to go darker just to send the chair away from the figure in space. Okay, let's keep playing with some color echoes. So we have a dark blue here in the t-shirt design. Let's use some of that turquoise and introduce it here. I think that works. And let's carry that purple over to some of the reflections in the pen. We have a metallic surface here, and maybe the reflections could be a mixture of purple and turquoise. Okay, let's work our way down. So maybe some of the details here could be sharper. So here maybe some of the reflections can go a little bit darker. That's going to help push this area forward and give our picture some additional depth. Again, generally speaking, I don't want to go darker than my line work. But I feel like we need some additional contrast here. And I can always go back in and reinforce some of the line work, make sure it starts popping out. And we're going to continue with using color echoes. So we've got some reds, let's put some reds in there. Okay, so here we have a little design that is in green. We can use turquoise, but maybe here I'm going to use a lighter green. Just to have a little more variety of color. And then introduce the same color in the design of the chair. So yet another color echo. You can have more than one, absolutely. We also have some reds. Okay, and I think this ties these two elements together. In fact, we can actually have some of the red we're using here. Okay, and now we're going to go back to the face and add some last second details. So our area of focus is here. We might have to go back in and add some additional line work. But really, this is going to be the last step. So one thing I've been doing to limit how dark my washes get is avoiding using this really dark transparent ultramarine blue and using a mixture of burnt sienna and cobalt blue to mix up my grays. In the very last step, I can kind of pull out all the stops, increase my range of contrast, and start introducing darks in the form of burnt umber and ultramarine blue. It's just one sneaky way of controlling the values and making sure that I don't go too dark, especially at the beginning of the composition. I think sometimes, even if you're aware of the principles, they're very easy to forget. So one thing you can do to reinforce those laws is just to play with your color mixtures. Start off by limiting your contrast by using lighter paint. So cobalt blue is lighter than ultramarine blue, burnt sienna is lighter than burnt umber. You're not going to be able to, or at least it's going to be harder to mix really dark with those two colors. They're going to tend to create lighter mixtures. Looser colors are also a little bit less transparent than burnt umber or ultramarine blue, which is something you have to be aware of. Right? You might lose a little bit of the transparency of color, but I think it's a decent trade-off. So you can see that I'm limiting the very darkest values to the area of focus, not the back of the hair, just here to frame off the composition. And I usually like to make the pupils some of the very darkest values in the composition. That's going to draw attention to the eyes. And even in the darkest shadows in the skin tone, I'm not going to go quite so dark. Why? Because skin tone has a vibrancy to it. Skin is partially transparent, light passes through it. Don't make your skin tones too dark. Reserve those strong darks for areas where it's truly needed. And one thing I like to do is to actually warm up some of the shadows. So inside the nostrils, for example, I like to add a little bit of red or Venetian red. Some of the very darkest shadows I like to add touches of red into. That gives the skin tone a little bit of extra vibrancy, like light is passing through it. This is a trick that you often see in oil painting. If you look up close to a painting by Rembrandt, by Velázquez, you'll notice that there are often a lot of very subtle warm values in the very darkest shadows. Just putting in some last second touches. Okay, let's add a little bit of color to the lips. Maybe a little bit of shadow underneath the eyes might be needed, especially here. And I'm going to call this sketch more or less complete. Here is the final image with the pencil marks erased, some touch-ups, and some additional line work. I hope this demonstration convinced you of the effectiveness of color echo in creating a unified composition. This is something that can and should be used every time you draw or paint in color, regardless of subject matter or style. Thank you so much for watching, and see you back in my messy studio very soon. Bye for now.